According to the National Children's Alliance, in 2019, child advocacy centers across the nation served approximately 371,000 children. Child advocacy centers are child-friendly facilities that offer safety, security, and a wide range of victim services for children and families that have been exposed to violence and abuse. These community-based centers and their staff serve as first responders in allegations of all types of child abuse.
My name is Ashley DeVoli. I am the program manager with the Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes. Our center serves hundreds of children and families in Seneca, Ontario, and Yates County. The Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes is a nationally accredited child advocacy center and coordinates services guided by standards put forth by the National Children's Alliance and the New York State Office of Children and Family Services. Today, I'm going to spend some time with you to explain the various services provided to children and families by the Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes. I will help provide some clarity regarding the various moving parts that exist during child abuse investigations. Research has identified best practices to involve the use of the multidisciplinary approach to child abuse investigations. Today, I will review these various types of abuse, the dynamics that impact children and families that we serve, and identify numerous ways we can help children have supportive caregivers as they navigate through this difficult process. I will provide ideas to further enhance the supportive caregiver role and summarize some of the services available to help children heal while also minimizing further trauma to the child.
Sometimes someone hurts you so bad.
I don't think you understand.
It stops hurting at all. Until something makes you feel again. And then it all comes back. Every word, every hurt, every moment. How could you ever understand where I come from? Even if you ask, even if you listen, you do not really hear or see or feel. You don't remember my story. You haven't walked my path. You haven't seen what I've seen. My past defines me. This is who I am. I am unseen, unheard, unwanted. That is what I am. even I am anything. It seemed like the same thing that held me up forced me down. The world turned upside down, and order disappeared. Nothing was how it was supposed to be. And a heavy sadness filled my soul. Deeper and deeper I fell within myself. And nothing could draw me out. Trapped in the misery of my life. Lost in the sorrow of my soul. Unable to see the light. Unable to see the dawn. To feel. To hope.
What are you doing taking my
To dream. And I found the darkest days of my life kept coming. The blackest nights for my soul never stopped. It seemed like it was always nighttime and nightmares, and never morning. And maybe you wonder why, but mostly you try not to think about it, and try to get by, and try to survive. And all the other stuff seems so much like nothing, compared to just wanting the most important things back again. Like wishing you could see your mama's smile again, and hear her sing that one favorite song that always calmed you down when things were all messed up. Or if you couldn't have her back, at least get to take care of your baby brother. 'Cause you know he needs you. He's gonna be so scared all alone. And who's gonna hold his hand and whisper it'll be alright to him? And who will whisper it to me?
So good to have you here. Are you ready to come in?
I know I am helpless, dependent, desperate, What happens when those you need the most threaten your very existence? I've heard plenty of promises, and they all sound the same. Push hard enough, and sooner or later, they all prove to be empty. The sun comes up every morning, but do you know where? Each place it's somewhere different. It's hard to find east when you keep moving around, but at least it comes. It always comes. I've come to depend on that. And slowly seasons changed around me. And it seemed this time that maybe the world would not be pulled out from under me again. Feet safe, roots starting to grow. Little buds of hope forming. Slowly attempting to trust this new life.
Hey, come on over. Let me show you what I got for you. Got you a gift.
I don't care about your dress. You don't care about your dress? I don't think you understand it. Look, I don't think you understand.
I wish someone would tell me it's gonna be okay.
I swear to God, you touch me again, I will kill you.
That one day, maybe, I feel normal. That I won't always be alone. That I'll have a mommy who will hug me and be strong for me. Because maybe I can't do it all by myself. This, my past, my history, my story, is not my fault. It's not because of me. It doesn't have to be what defines my future. I am lovable. I am worthy of care. And that glimmer of light, it makes all the difference. The glimmers of light give me hope that someday my summer will come.
The statistics of child maltreatment and neglect have really demonstrated the severity of the problem of child abuse. Looking at this chart developed by the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, we can see the extraordinarily high rate of abuse across the lifespan of children in 2019. There is a variation of how the data is presented with differences among varying research organizations, but overall, there is compelling evidence that this is a major crisis across the nation. Nearly 700,000 children are abused in the United States every year. 678,000 children were victims of abuse and neglect in 2018. This is the most recent year for which there is national data. That's approximately 1% of kids in a given year. This data is probably incomplete, and the actual number of children that are abused is likely underreported. Child welfare authorities ensure the safety of more than 3.5 million children. More than 3.5 million children receive an investigation or an alternative response from CPS. An estimated 1.9 million children will receive some sort of prevention services. As we can see by this chart, the youngest children are the most vulnerable. Children in their first year of life have had the highest rate of victimization, and according to this chart, that's 2.7% of all children in that age group. Nationally, neglect is the most common form of abuse. 3 out of 5, or nearly 61% of victims were neglected only. More than 10% were physically abused only, and 7% were sexually abused only. Yet the statistics indicate a more complex problem where children experience multiple forms of abuse. In 2018, more than 15% of children were polyvictimized. This means that they suffered 2 or more forms of abuse. Yet child advocacy centers across the nation serve far more sexual abuse cases, indicating a much deeper problem. CACs investigated approximately 243,000 cases involving child sexual abuse allegations in 2019. While not all of these cases resulted in disclosures, charges, or convictions, it's an indication that the problem of child sexual abuse may be much larger than federal statistics show us. So we've talked a little bit about child abuse and the statistics of child abuse. And now we're going to go into more depth talking specifically about child sexual abuse. We know that 1 in 10 children will be sexually abused by their 18th birthday. A third of children who are sexually abused are abused by an older child. And over 90% of children who are abused are molested by someone that they know, love, and trust. This is incredibly important when we are providing services to children, knowing that if 90% of those children are abused at the hands of someone that they know, love, and trust, this is going to create a lot of difficulties in getting disclosures from children. More than 50% of children are younger than the age of 12. Have you ever talked to a child younger than the age of 12? 60% of child sexual abuse victims never tell anyone. Children with disabilities are 2 to 6 times more likely to be sexually abused. We're going to talk a little bit more later about the vulnerabilities that exist with children, making child sexual abuse so underreported. Additionally, we know that fabricated reports of child sexual abuse only make up 1 to 4% of child abuse cases. 75% of that very small number are done so by adults, meaning children may come forward and make some sort of a disclosure of child abuse, and we then find out that the allegations were fabricated by an adult coaching them. Children generally do not make up reports of child sexual abuse, and the statistics show that children make up less than 1% of false reports. We also know that sexually abused children who keep it a secret, or those that tell and are not believed, are at a much greater risk than the general population for psychological, emotional, and social problems, often lasting into adulthood. People who abuse children often look like everyone else. Remember, we talked about the fact that 90% of children who are abused by someone that they know, love, and trust. Approximately 70% of sexual offenders of children have between 1 and 9 victims. 20 to 25% have 10 to 40 victims. And some serial child molesters may have as many as 400 victims in their lifetime. Now we're going to take some time to talk about different forms of child abuse. we'll go into depth about what the legal definition is of each form and how it may look when we're talking about children. So here you can see the legal definition of child physical abuse. Physical abuse means the physical injury, including but not limited to bruising, welts, burns, fractures, or other visible signs of injury. Substantial injury may also result from punching, beating, kicking, biting, burning, or otherwise harming a child. Although the injury is not an accident, it's important to remember that the caretaker may not have intended to hurt the child. The injury may have resulted from excessive discipline or physical punishment that is inappropriate to a child's age or condition. The injury may also be a result of a single episode or of repeated episodes that can range in severity from minor bruising to death. So what does child physical abuse look like, or what indicators may exist? Here on this slide, you can see numerous indicators that may indicate a child is being physically abused. It is important to remember, however, that although there are indicators that exist, it does not necessarily mean that a child is being abused. The impact of physical abuse on a child's life can be incredibly intense. It's especially devastating when a parent, the person a child depends on for protection and safety, becomes a danger to them. Children who have been physically abused may struggle with developing and maintaining friendships, distrust authority figures, have poor self-worth, and struggle with their self-esteem. Children may also blame themselves for the abuse and feel like they must keep what's going on in their family a secret. Reactions vary depending on the age of the child, the kind of the abuse, and how long it has continued. Many physically abused children will become aggressive themselves or have behavioral problems. Aggression and acting out are very common, but there are a wide range of reactions. Some children show few, if any, reactions at all. They don't seem to care anymore if they're hit. They've lost the normal flight or fight reactions that are built in to protect us from danger. They may also fail to react to other dangers. They may stop trying to make friends or succeed at school or plan for the future. Punishment does not have to lead to physical injury to cause psychological problems. A number of studies have shown that children who are exposed to physical threats and aggression by acts of their caretaker may develop PTSD reactions and other psychological problems such as aggressive behavior, depression, and anxiety. Another form of child abuse is child neglect and maltreatment. A maltreated child is a child under the age of 18 years old whose physical, mental, or emotional condition has been impaired or is in imminent danger of becoming impaired as a result of the failures of his parent or another person legally responsible for their care to exercise their minimum degree of care. This type of child abuse may be much more difficult to find indicators and to see that what's happening to the child is neglectful or abusive. As with physical abuse, there may be physical indicators that may exist. Here we can see a number of different indicators that may show us that a child is being neglected or maltreated. Again, as I previously mentioned, just because this indicator exists does not mean that a child is being abused. It often can help to ask more questions and to find out what's going on in the child's life. Another form of abuse that we will briefly talk about is the commercial sexual exploitation of children, also known as CSEC. It's important to remember that CSEC happens in every community to children of all ages and genders. The sexual exploitation of a child is obtaining or using a child younger than the age of 17 years old for a commercial sex act. Child sex trafficking is when a child who has received food, drugs, money, or other exchange for a sexual act. Here we can see outlined some different indicators of the commercial sexual exploitation of children. It's important to remember that a lot of these things children do in their everyday lives. But some things, such as unexplained absences, unexplained tattoos or branding, running away, engaging in ways that are not age appropriate, indication of drug or alcohol abuse, some of these indicators, although alone, may just be a difficulty that a child is having in their life. This also may be an indicator that a child is at risk of being trafficked or is being trafficked. Another form of abuse is child sexual abuse. Child sexual abuse is the sexual exploitation of a child by a parent, relative, caretaker, or another person responsible for the child. This abuse can include acts such as fondling, intercourse, or the use of a child in a production of a pornographic material. Child sexual abuse can take many different forms of abuse and different acts. It's really important to remember that most children who are sexually abused are abused in a progressive manner. Oftentimes, they also will experience many different forms of sexual abuse. These forms can include fondling and touching of genital areas, making a child touch an adult in a sexual manner, attempted or actual sexual intercourse or rape of a child, the prostitution, trafficking, or exploitation of a child using social media. Exhibitionism is involving exposing genitals, and when someone becomes sexually excited or has a strong desire to observe other people during sexual activity. Voyeurism is involving someone becoming sexually aroused by watching an unsuspecting person who is disrobing, naked, or engaging in sexual activity. Watching pornography with a child or creating pornographic material with a child. And sexual language and talking to children about sexual acts or trying to teach them different things about sex. Children who have been sexually abused may display a range of emotional and behavioral reactions, many of which are characteristic of children who have experienced other types of trauma. Outlined here, we can see lots of different indicators that may shed some light to us that a child may be sexually abused. It's incredibly important to also remember that some of these indicators may also exist in a child and may be normal depending on their developmental state. It's also important, as I mentioned before, that just because a child is experiencing or demonstrating one of these indicators, it does not mean that they're being sexually abused necessarily, but certainly it should raise a red flag for us to show us that there's something going on. Certainly some are more obvious than others. If we have a young child that has a sexually transmitted disease, or a young child who has become pregnant, those ones are more obvious that a child is being sexually abused. But others, such as a child drawing pictures that are unusual or having imitating sexual behavior, we call these problematic sexual behaviors, and we're going to talk a little bit more about them later on. Some others might be eating or sleep disturbances, excessive fear, anxiety, enuresis or encapresis. This is when a child who had previously met the milestone of potty training may have regression and may start wetting or stooling their pants, or having difficulties with going to the bathroom. Other disturbances can include, sleep disturbances, problems in school, problem with peers, fears of being around certain people or being left alone with someone. As children get older, some of the indicators may include truancy and running away, self-mutilation behavior. Many of these children who have experienced sexual abuse may show these behavioral and emotional changes, but it's also important to remember that many do not. It's critical to focus not only on the detection, but on the prevention and communication. We do this by teaching children about body safety, healthy body boundaries, and encouraging open communication about sexual manners. We're also going to talk a little bit later about kind of normal and healthy sexual development and what that may look like, and some resources that might help you a little bit more on that topic. So I mentioned the term problematic sexual behaviors, and what problematic sexual behaviors is when a child starts to demonstrate sexual behaviors such as acting out or experimenting on other children, drawing pictures, talking. A lot of those different behaviors, some of those can be completely normal based on a child's developmental level, but some may not. And certainly when a child is set a boundary, when there's a boundary set by an adult that something is okay or not okay, and a child continues to do that, they can become problematic. But it's important to remember that sometimes problematic sexual behaviors, as you can see outlined here, could be an indicator of sexual abuse. There's also a lot of other indicators that could exist that could be impacting a child and leading to these problematic sexual behaviors. Some of these are media exposure, TV, video games, even our basic cable television often is allowed to have very sexualized events in the movies or even commercials. Can be very sexualized in nature. And when a child's exposed to this without an understanding of what that means or what it does, it could lead to problematic sexual behaviors from that child. Lack of boundaries, inadequate supervision of a child. Children mimic things. That's how they learn and grow and develop. So certainly if a child observes a sexual act on television or is exposed to child pornography inadvertently on a tablet, or say they're on social media and they're exposed to something, sometimes children will mimic the things that they see, and sometimes that can be normal. When it becomes problematic is when boundaries are set and a child continues to act out in that way. Other things could be physical and hormonal changes, sexualized environments, especially when we're talking about substance abuse in the home. If there's a lot of people coming in and out of the home, that can lead to problematic sexual behaviors, especially if there isn't good supervision and clear boundaries established within the household. So on the previous slide, we talked a little bit about the possible explanations as to why children develop problematic sexual behaviors. And it's important to note that just because they have risk factors, not all children will develop these behaviors. And sometimes with appropriate response by an adult and have it limit setting and having boundaries set with a child, these behaviors may go away. Sometimes these behaviors can become more frequent and be repeated behaviors, oftentimes to the extent of hurting themselves. Certainly if you have a young child who is inserting objects inside of their body, it can certainly lead to them causing injury. It can also lead to further progression of a child and can become more frequent and intense for them. Sexual behaviors towards others, such as touching an adult or touching other children. If a child is not responding to that limit setting, that can become very problematic. Also, when we have problematic sexual behaviors that progress in frequency and in intensity, especially if we have a child acting out another child, it's really important for a child to have that addressed immediately. Sometimes it occurs between children of different ages, different developmental levels. Our development is really important when we're talking about problematic sexual behaviors because, again, I mentioned some of these behaviors can be a normal part of their sexual development, and with appropriate limit setting, it may no longer be problematic. But with some children, behaviors can become aggressive and forceful, especially when we're talking about children acting out on other children. The important piece that I want you to take away from this is that sometimes children can develop problematic sexual behaviors, and it does not mean that they've been sexually abused. It does, however, at times, when children are sexually abused, can lead to problematic sexual behaviors. So if a child is not responding to that redirection, it's going to be important to make sure that we're seeking the appropriate counseling or services that may be needed to help kind of figure out where that problematic sexual behavior is coming from and how we can create stronger redirections with a child. So I've talked quite a bit about sexual behaviors and development and how sometimes these behaviors may actually be developmentally appropriate for a child. I certainly could talk all day long about different development with children and what is developmentally appropriate versus not appropriate, but certainly that could take a really long time. So one thing that I find very helpful is to offer resources. And this is a resource that I find to be incredibly helpful. There's two different books. One was developed in 2014 and then expanded in 2015. And I know that seems like it might be outdated, but it really does outline different sexual behaviors in children. And it even goes as far as to develop charts. There's developed charts within these books that show us what are normal sexual behaviors with children. And the chart actually outlines it into three different categories of what is normal and healthy, what may become problematic, and when do we need to seek professional intervention with certain behaviors. And it's broken down by different categories of age and development. And I really would encourage you to take a look at Tony Kavanaugh Johnson's books. We give these booklets out with every family that comes to the Child Advocacy Center. And certainly they are available to you. You can certainly reach out to me at any time, and I can try to help make sure that you have access to these resources. So I wanted to take a brief moment to just check in and remind everyone that what we're talking about can be incredibly difficult. The content of this presentation is very heavy, and for most, it is very difficult to talk about and to learn about. So I just want to be mindful of that and to remind everyone to take care of yourself. It's incredibly important, the work that we do and the help that we provide to the children and the families that we serve in our communities is so important, and it needs to start with us acknowledging the difficulties that may exist within ourselves and be mindful of that and practice good self-care. So we spent some time talking about different forms of child abuse and the indicators that may exist when we're talking about these different forms of abuse with children. And now we're going to take a little bit of time to delve into a little bit more about how offenders choose their victims and the different stages that exist when we're talking about child sexual abuse. Outlined here, you can see different reasons why offenders may choose their victims or ways in which they choose their victims. This slide is important because a lot of times we will have contact with children who are greatly at risk and often overlook these situations as possible risk factors to becoming victims of child sexual abuse. One of the most important things is that oftentimes offenders will choose their victims based on apparent vulnerabilities. Some of these vulnerabilities may include their status in their home, living in a divorced home. We know statistically that children that live in a divorced home are at a greater risk for being a victim of child sexual abuse. Emotional or psychological states, such as a needy child, a depressed or unhappy child, offenders will latch onto this. And especially with the use of social media, it is a lot easier for offenders to connect with children and certainly have a lot more information. When children have social media and they share a lot of this information, it kind of allows offenders to not have to do a lot of homework about the victims that they're choosing. Children who lack self-confidence or self-esteem, certainly, an offender will latch onto that and notice that a child, especially when we're talking about an adolescent, we know that adolescent females are at greater risk for being offended by an offender. And a lot of this has to do with that vulnerability that exists. An offender will latch onto that vulnerability. And certainly a child who has a low self-esteem, having a new friend or having an older, male or female come forward and say, I really love you, you're beautiful, or you're amazing. And hearing those things helps increase their self-esteem, which also makes more of a connection with the offender. Sometimes, living in a divorced home, we talked about that, a second ago. The reason why that risk may be higher is because a lot of times a divorced home, offenders often groom the parents as well as the children. So, we have a neighbor that comes forward and, we have a single mom or a single dad who, is working to try to make ends meet to provide for their family. And then, a neighbor may come in and say, hey, I can help, and, I can help you around the home more, and I can provide financially or take your children and watch them. And kind of being in that situation may seem like it's helpful rather than a risk. Certainly a child that has familial problems, children who have lack of supervision or who may need help, if an offender is able to recognize those things, they can certainly use them as a vulnerability to establish a relationship and build rapport with a child and even their family, putting them at greater risk for abuse. So a second ago, I mentioned the word grooming, and oftentimes this is a word that is used in the child abuse field a lot. And what does that really mean? Like, what is grooming? So when we're talking about child sexual abuse, most offenders don't just rape children as it's perceived on the media or we see on television. Typically, child sexual abuse is a process that involves a progression, and that progression involves grooming or developing trust from a child. This grooming is a way in which an offender can try to protect themselves. And a child, the progression happens in a way that is meeting the needs of a child. So you may engage with a child, and an offender may buy them things or make them feel like they're cared about by the offender. So in this grooming process, that sexual interaction and that progression may happen slowly, sometimes not so much. Now, I want to point out the fact that there are times that children are just raped, that it might be a one-time event, but typically that's not the case. Statistically speaking, there's usually a progression of the abuse. So a child, is friended and a rapport is built with an offender, and then, with a young child, they may slowly have them sit on their lap and, accidentally touch them to see kind of the child's reaction and what happens. And sometimes this progression occurs in a way, and then they develop secrets, or they might create safeguards for the offender to keep the child from telling other people. That then, goes into the disclosure phase, when we're talking about a disclosure and why children tell or don't tell. And secrecy and that grooming process certainly impacts the disclosure phase in a great way. We talked earlier about the fact that a lot of times children don't ever tell about the abuse. And we know that 90% of offenders are, people that the kid know, love, and trust. So when that happens and we have a child that's put in a situation that they're being sexually abused, if they even understand that it's abuse, some children don't even understand that what's happening to them is not okay, which is the importance of body safety and why we always try to talk about what is okay and not okay for a child. Certainly there are times also when children tell and they disclose and an adult might not believe them, or, we'll talk a little bit more about recantation and the suppression once it does come out. It's also very difficult when we're talking about child abuse investigations with child sexual abuse, and children have a lot more reasons to not tell. If they make a disclosure and then all of a sudden their world is turned upside down because all these things are happening, because the offender is arrested or they're no longer allowed in the home, but they were the primary caregiver. Remember, we talked about that grooming, and that engagement occurs not only with children, but sometimes with the adults in their lives. And again, that's a safety that a lot of offenders use to try to keep children from telling, and also to protect themselves for if a child does tell, are the other people that are in their lives, are the other adults that are there to protect that child going to believe what they're telling them. So if you try to look up information on child sexual abuse, there is so much information available in terms of research about why offenders abuse children, why children react in certain ways when they are abused, and what's happening in their minds when these things happen, and different psychological conditions that come as a result of abuse. But one thing that is incredibly helpful when we're talking about child sexual abuse is the reasons why children kind of go through that progression. And Roland Summit in 1983 developed a paper and developed what we call child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome. Although this is called a syndrome, it's actually not diagnostic in nature, and it's important to note that it's a framework that really provides an explanation as to why children react to abuse in the way that they do. I often talk about the impacts, why children wait to disclose and often will recant. And this accommodation syndrome really kind of outlines a lot of those reasons. We talk about the difference in children who tell versus don't tell, but a lot of times when children do tell, they often will recant what they say. Perpetrators use a lot of methods to scare or intimidate children to keep the abuse a secret. And Roland Summit really just did an excellent job kind of outlining these into kind of 5 stages or 5 categories on why children react the way that they do. The first one being secrecy. So a lot of times we talked a little bit about that progression. Offenders will use these methods to try to convince them that no one will believe them if anyone, was to be told about what happened. Children are impressionable, and their sense of right and wrong is normalized by what adults do and say. And a lot of times it's very easy for a perpetrator to convince a child, especially young children, they're taught to obey and respect adults. And children want to please adults. So they often will feel powerless to say no to someone who's in kind of that caregiving role. Children often will also have difficulty comprehending, consequences of inappropriate sexual behavior by a family member. They're taught that strangers are the enemy and the immediate risk to their safety. So knowing that there's such a high percentage of sexual abuse that is perpetrated in the home by family members, it only further increases that kind of imbalance of power and that feeling of helplessness that a child may face. That second category talks about that helplessness, and children may feel that threat of loss of love, their security, and even their fear of what's going to happen to their family member. Entrapment and accommodation. We talked a little bit about sexual abuse being kind of a repeat occurrence. Typically, it's not just a one-time event. It's kind of a progression that occurs. So if a child doesn't receive any type of intervention near the time that first assault occurs, children will have a really difficult time and often feel, that helplessness that they don't have the option to stop it from happening again. So in an effort to survive and keep their family together, they learn to accommodate, or they allow it to continue to happen so they can, not face those feelings of guilt or those feelings of betrayal. The accommodating behaviors will show up in a lot of different ways and are sometimes a way for a child to feel a sense of power and control. We're going to talk a little bit more later about disclosures, but one of Roland Summit's categories was delayed and conflicted or unconvincing disclosures. So the majority of child sexual abuse never goes reported. And oftentimes children will never even disclose it to another person. But if they do, it's because they've never been triggered. Or if they don't, it's because they've never been triggered. And sometimes this accommodation has already begun. So the child fears that they might just be seen as being in trouble. The behaviors that they have may make it difficult for a parent or a guardian to believe them that it's happening. And unless someone is specifically trained in child sexual abuse, most adults don't believe that that's something that would happen and occur for so long without a child speaking up. And children, are often viewed as, fantastical in nature, and they make things up, or they might not be believed by an adult. And retraction or recantation, coming forward with a claim of child sexual abuse, can also feel like a re-victimization. So being questioned by a family member or law enforcement or CPS, this really may be difficult for a child, and they may fear, losing further security. As a result, sometimes victims will, recant their abuse in an effort to preserve their family. certainly if we have a young child and now, dad is being arrested, or, mom is crying all the time because now she has no money because, mom's boyfriend is no longer in the home, or if, an older sister had been the abuser and now she's no longer in the home and the parents are upset, children will recognize all these things that are happening, and sometimes it's easier for them to recant what happened. It's incredibly important for us to remember that when a child recants, it does not mean that they were not abused. So we know statistically a lot of times children don't talk about the abuse and they don't ever tell. Some of the external pressures that may exist is anger from other siblings. They might have threats. Remember, we talked about secrecy from an offender or a perpetrator and the things that they may say or do to keep a child from disclosing. And young children especially, if an offender says, I will kill your family, a lot of times that's taken very seriously, especially by a young child. Having that fear of not being believed or having the pressure from a non-offending caregiver. So if mom's boyfriend is the offender and all of a sudden they're no longer in the home and mom's really upset because she doesn't have a way to make ends meet, that pressure can be extremely difficult for a child. So if they recognize that pressure prior to disclosing, they may never tell. Certainly, children that are in foster care or have fears of financial pressure on the family. And then all those internal pressures that exist. And sometimes these internal pressures exist for children, not just with child sexual abuse, but for a lot of things. Some of them are guilt, self-blame. They may feel ashamed. When we're talking about adolescents that engage, accommodate to their offenders, they may feel really bad that they accommodated the abuse. Sometimes having that embarrassment or the perceived responsibility for destroying the family. Children want to please adults. They want things to go well. And if they know by telling what happened, it's going to cause a lot of stress or difficulties in the family, they might take that and not tell anyone. So some other reasons why children might not tell is due to lack of awareness. We always talk about it's so important to teach body safety. We know statistically that children are abused more likely by someone they know, love, and trust. So it's really important at a very young age to be, teaching your children and making sure that they have developmentally appropriate sexual knowledge. And some children can learn body safety as young as 3 or 4 years old, remembering to use the appropriate words and terminology. I can't tell you the number of times that I've interviewed a child that they refer to their private areas as, a cookie or, my nuggets or something that is involving food. And although sometimes that is a lot easier to do, it's so important that we're teaching them the appropriate terminology for their body parts, because certainly when something happens, them knowing the correct terminology is just as important for them to have an understanding of their body safety. With some children, it can be very confusing. We are sexual beings, so when you touch the private area of another person or something of that nature, it's abusive, but it's very confusing for children, especially at a younger age, because it does feel good. It doesn't necessarily hurt them. And if they also, paired with the fact that they don't understand that what's happening is not okay, and it happens over a period of time, children may not understand that what's happening to them is actually abuse. Sometimes children often need to build rapport before telling. We often say that children will tell several different times before, making a disclosure of what's happened, because they test the waters. Just like kids with every other learning experience in their lives, they test things before they come out with something. And that's just kind of a natural progression of learning, through a development. So the same thing with child sexual abuse and disclosures. It's just really important to make sure that children have the developmentally appropriate knowledge for body safety. So that way, when something does happen that's not okay, they understand that that's not okay. we've talked about that recantation and some of the different reasons why. This slide really outlines a lot of the different reasons that we see in children that do make disclosures and then recant. Again, as you can see in this, on the slide, all the different reasons, a lot of times it comes back to kind of that internal struggle that a child has and their desire to want things to be okay.
I was the bright blonde hair and blue sailor suits, and you do what you're supposed to do. We had the dogs in the river and homemade biscuits, and life was wonderful. Fisher was the athletic trainer for the football team. What a great place for a pedophile. I hold the school much more responsible than Fisher, not because they have deep pockets, because I think they just willfully let children get hurt.
I was born to a schizophrenic mother. She was not able to care for me because of her mental illness. So I was placed with my aunt. My aunt was a very strict disciplinary. I grew up in church. I would say it became very physically abusive. At the age of 4, I started to be sexually abused by some adult cousins who were also in the household.
Margaret Holzer. I am a 2-time Olympian, 3-time Olympic medalist. So I was abused from 5 to 7 years old by a good friend of mine's father. I was going to their house on a regular basis for play dates. They were coming to my house on a regular basis. So this was a man that I trusted, that, my parents trusted.
My dad moved back and forth from the United States to Guatemala so he can provide for the family. And in the Latin American communities, we just tend to live in a large cluster of people. And when my mom used to go out with my other aunts to go shopping, they left my older cousins there to stay with us. And it was this one specific cousin. But it was him specifically that kind of targeted me.
As a child, you don't think of adults as manipulative or hurtful or anything like that.
But I can tell you that the first time I met this man, I had concerns about him, and yet we continued to allow him to be a part of our lives. And part of that was because there was a professional relationship. He was on staff with my husband at our church.
There was a female cousin of mine that used to come and visit often, and it just started off as small events leading up to much larger events. She would have me to touch her, or she would try to touch me. The other abuse started around age 7. And my mom, she had a live-in boyfriend at the time who was a firefighter. He would sneak into my room in the middle of the night. And initially, I thought it was a dream.
What was more traumatic about the experience for me was feeling helpless. It was, I would beg my parents not to leave me at this house, but they would go out for the weekends. And so they would leave me there as a babysitter. And I would know it was going to happen. And I would just be so angry. And then everybody would go to sleep, and I would just wait for him to come.
I grew up in the picture-perfect family. I was called the debutante Miss America. I was the first Miss America that they ever brought a family up on stage. My father continued to sexually violate children and teenagers until he died at age 75.
I was a regular kid. Unfortunately for us, my parents, they didn't know that they were bringing someone who was a pedophile in. He was the actually the teenage son of our babysitter. I still cannot even say what really happened other than he had sexual acts with me and had me performing, but I still can't say it. I mean, I don't know if I ever will. I feel I had to free myself from feeling guilty, feeling responsible, like I was dirty. Who would want me? You know, it's all these things are in your head.
How could someone hurt me like this if I have any type of value? How could somebody do this to me and care about me in any way, shape, or form? I really must be nothing.
Out of that situation was born of just a deep anger in me, a resentment towards adults, towards caretakers, the people in charge. And I also didn't understand that he didn't have the right to do this to me.
I had a fear of saying no to people because I felt like if I said no, they were just going to take it anyway. I became very bitter, very cold, very angry at the world.
I felt like I didn't have any choices after that moment.
I'm not who you think I am at all. I'm a really bad person.
I was going to kill myself.
And that's what I feel that was taken from me. My virginity, my youth. You're never the same after that.
There's a part of me from this that can give love, but has trouble really receiving deep love because I never feel that I'm really worthy of it.
I held a lot of resentment toward my mom for many years because I could not understand how she didn't know. I could not understand how you didn't know that this man was sneaking out of your bed and into mine.
My mother telling me that we were going to have a family member that was going to move with us to the United States because he needed to raise some money. He was trying to get his life together. And then I remember coming home from high school, and it was that cousin that had, raped me when I was a kid.
Nobody outside of the home should know what's going on inside the home. And it's a terrible, terrible belief. It goes so far, even to the extent that the perpetrator is often protected just so that it doesn't get out.
My mother walked down the hallway one night. He'd been in my room for maybe a half hour. And all of a sudden, I heard footsteps coming down. I could hear the first step and then the second step, very, very, very slowly, and then the third step. And she was now about 12 feet from my door. And I waited to hear another step. And it was a dramatic moment when everything stopped for all three of us. All three of us knew exactly what each one of us was thinking and knew. It's the only time I ever felt my father afraid. He just stopped. And I thought, it's going to be over. She's going to come in. And we waited for that dramatic moment. And then I heard a step up the steps and up the steps and up the steps. And I knew she would never come through that door. And I knew she would never, ever come to help me. Maybe she just couldn't deal with it, so she just put it somewhere and wouldn't think about it. But I do believe she made a decision. I believe she made a choice. And she didn't choose me.
Going into camping trips, I knew, I'm going to have a blast until nighttime comes. And then he's going to make me take my clothes off and lay in bed while he touches me.
She decided to make me touch her, and she, of course, me, and she ultimately wanted me to lick her. And so I had to do that, and I did that. And that was one of the worst memories I have. It was a memory that I tucked away for a very long time.
I remember being 16 years old.
and him pinning me against the wall. And he said something like, I'm going to show you what I should have showed you those years ago, and tried to do it again.
There were many occasions that he tried to force himself onto me, make me watch pornographic videos and try to make me do the things that were in the videos.
She said, you said he pried you open. I said, I did say that, Mother, because they're writing that he abused me. And that's a very easy word to dismiss. If I say he pried me open, which he did, that's a visual that helps people to better understand what he did to me thousands of times over 13 years.
For some reason, as a child, you don't speak up about those things. I don't know why. I try to think back, like, why didn't I just say what was going on? And I really don't know why I didn't just come out and say that was happening. Maybe it's because I wasn't so sure that it was right or wrong. I just knew that I didn't like it, and I didn't want it to happen anymore.
What words would a sixth grader use to, may I have some coffee? And by the way, this teacher put me in his mouth.
But I remember when she thought something, she called me in her bed, her and my dad's bedroom. She went, don't you let nobody touch you. Well, it had already happened. And the way she said it made me feel like, now that I've already let it happen, how can I tell you? Because you'd be mad at me.
My sister is 4 years younger than me, so I never wanted him to touch her. I could have gone to my grandmother's house and stayed. You know, I had teachers at school that really cared about me that I could have gone to, but I chose to stay and endure what I was enduring because I figured if I left that he would then turn on her.
And it wasn't like some creepy guy with a trench coat on. It's our babysitter's son.
He was funny. He had a Porsche.
He didn't come asking for help or anything like that. He came offering to help.
He was always a part of the game. He was very charismatic. People liked being around him.
A lot of talk and Mr. Cool.
Very respectful.
Kind of like a grandfather type.
If we were playing tag, he was playing. If we were climbing trees, he was climbing trees with us.
A real upstanding, good kid.
He was a natural leader.
He was from my community.
He made himself the person who solved problems for people.
He worked with children all of his life.
I drank every day. And so it's really hard to be a junior in high school drinking every day and function.
When you hold something for 26 years, never tell a soul, even though I could bury it, it still would just always come up. And when I finally did it, my body just fell apart.
I started getting sick all the time. I started having weird headaches. I started getting just really sick all the time, and eventually to the point where I couldn't stay conscious.
At the age of 16, I became a teenage mom without any resources to provide for myself. I could not provide for my daughter. I sent her to stay with her father, and I was devastated because I felt that not only did my mom not raise me, now I am repeating that. And I became suicidal. I was very depressed.
And so when this guy that I met at the mall offered me a new life, I wanted to run. I wanted a new life. The pimp came back after a couple of hours, and he said he had to go over the rules with me. And he said things like, I have to take $200 an hour, talk to this kind of guy, that kind of guy. He gave me a new name, a new birthday.
And, when I look back, too, I think I kind of went through a lot of women, too, just to always prove for myself my sexuality and things like that.
So for me, that was my coping mechanism, to emotionally shut down and just expect the worst from everybody.
I've been married for 10 years now. And it's not until now, it took me 10 years to figure out that sex is not just something you do. You know, sex is a special bond. And somebody just took that from me.
Generally, in our culture, adults' rights trump children. So we believe the adults over the children, and we tend to think more about the impact on the adult than on the child. We think about the disruption to this person who harmed the child's life, career, and reputation more than the trauma to the child.
Law enforcement is never going to investigate their way out of these type of crimes, these crimes against children. It's only through prevention that we can help stem the tide.
We're going to have to help people in our world understand how trauma impacts not just the child, but without treatment and without intervention, how it really impacts almost every social ill that we spend so much money on every day in this country.
If we begin to have policies in our churches, in our youth serving organizations, that both educates the adults as well as educates the kids, and it creates a different kind of social norm that is going to say that this is something that our community cares about kids, and our community cares about stopping sexual abuse.
Corporations have a huge role in how these children are viewed, how they're viewed as sex objects, and they need to take a stand to make sure that children continue to be children and they're not portrayed as sexual objects. They're not portrayed as making them a sexual item or being sexualized.
We also need a clear message, which we are not giving now in our society, that it is not okay for adults to sexually use their own or anybody else's children.
You know, this does happen. Abuse happens. It happened in 1950. It happened yesterday. It can unravel and cause lots of damage, or you can stop it and interrupt it and limit the collateral damage. So back to your original question, why was I willing to do this? You know, if you can stop the collateral damage here, as opposed to 18 years later, that makes a huge difference. And if you spare one child, and people don't have a clue the ripples from one child. So you stop one source of ripples, and that is huge.
During child sexual abuse investigations, I often am telling team members that disclosure is a process. It's a lot easier for a child to say that something didn't happen. I have a quote down here that says, "The easiest lie is no, it didn't happen. The most difficult lie is a detailed report of an event." So when a child makes a disclosure and then they're questioned about what happens, it's a lot easier for them to say it didn't happen, because otherwise we're asking them all those details, and there's a lot of factors that come into play that can impact their ability to be able to make those disclosures. So for this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about what are the different types of disclosures when we're talking about this process. So on here, we have outlined accidental disclosures, or those disclosures that are revealed by chance. And then we have purposeful disclosures, where a child has consciously decided to tell. A child who accidentally discloses, such as they might confide in a friend, at school, and then that that friend goes and tells an adult, they'll often recant or even try to say like, oh, it was a misunderstanding. That didn't really happen. Like, oh, they're lying. I never said that. Those disclosures are often more difficult to get children to talk about it because they haven't really made that decision to come out with the detailed account of what happened to them. Now, purposeful disclosures is kind of where we would prefer children to be. Certainly, we don't get to choose. But if a child is coming to the Child Advocacy Center to have what we call a forensic interview, it's much easier with a child who is in this kind of purposeful disclosure phase. Because at this point, a child has consciously decided, I'm going to tell, they're ready to talk about it, and they want to reveal the things that have happened. So it's a lot easier to ask them those questions of the who, what, when, where than it is with a child who hasn't even made that decision quite yet. And they might not be ready to tell. So we get asked a lot when a child discloses, what should we do when they come out and they make a disclosure? So it's important to remember when a child discloses that we always want to make sure that we tell them that it's not their fault, that what happened to them is not something that they caused, and that they're not in any kind of trouble. We want to believe the child. We want to make sure that they understand that what's happened to them is important to us and that we believe what they're saying. It's incredibly important to remain calm. A lot of times children are going to be testing the waters, like I mentioned before, and they're going to look for the reactions of the adult. So if a child comes to you and makes a disclosure and your reaction is being horrified or shocked, or if a child makes a disclosure to their parent and they become really upset, or, a lot of negative reactions, this is going to increase the likelihood that the child is going to shut down and they're not going to continue making any further disclosures. It's important to be honest with a child. We don't want to make promises to a child or tell them that something's going to happen when we don't know for a fact that that's going to happen. Unfortunately, the way the criminal justice system is, we oftentimes have found that what should happen, in our mind when we're talking about like our moral compass, that's not necessarily how the legal system is aligning with punishments in terms of abuse. You want to listen more than you talk. When a child is making a disclosure to you, you want them to tell you in their words, and you want them to be able to express it in the way that they want to. It's also important not to ask a lot of questions. We know that when we're talking to children, especially children under the age of 9, they're very open to what we call suggestive questions, and they can be led very easily. So it's also incredibly important in terms of an investigation to just listen to a child. Let them tell you what it is that they want to tell you. Tell them that what they're telling you is incredibly important, and that you can prepare a child to talk to other people that might need to ask them further questions. You want to focus on their needs, not yours. So in that moment, if the child is having, a mental health breakdown, if they're having difficulties talking about things, it's important to remember that although it can be very triggering for an adult, it can make us angry, it can make us sad. We may have our own kind of mental health going on when that happens, depending on kind of what's happened to you in your life. And it's really important in that moment when a child is disclosing to really focus on what they need. Allow yourself to provide for their needs, and then after that, focus on you. We want to make children feel like they're safe. We want to protect them. Safety plans are critical, and it's so important to ask a child, what can I do to make you feel safer? Do you feel safe where you are right now? We want to use developmentally appropriate language. I can't tell you the number of times that I have interviewed children and they use words that just don't make sense for a child that age. So if a young child is coming in and saying, my neighbor had intercourse with me, and then I'm asking them what intercourse means, and they're not able to tell me that can really be conflicting with what a child is disclosing. So making sure use their language, what they're calling something. It's okay to kind of parrot that back and make sure that we're using that language. And certainly when we're calling in or reporting an allegation of abuse, we want to make sure that we are explaining the language that child used. We want to validate the child's feelings and thought. We want to let them know that it's okay to feel the way that they're feeling. Some children may feel scared that something is going to happen. If a child, say you have a young male that the allegation is against their mother, and certainly they're really scared and they don't want anything to happen to their mom because they love their mom and they care for their mom and they trust their mom. So certainly it's important that although we know what's happened is not okay, and that it's child sexual abuse or it's child abuse, it's important to validate how they're feeling. And you want to be mindful of your body language when this is happening. A lot of times this can be very difficult to talk about. But again, our children are going to be observing us, and they're going to be looking to you to see kind of how they're going to proceed next. You want to reflect back what you hear from the child and make sure that you're understanding what they're saying. So if a child makes a statement to you and says something, reflect it back to them to make sure that you're understanding what they're saying. And certainly when a child makes a disclosure, you want to call local law enforcement and or Child Protective Services by making a hotline call and making sure that you're giving us the information that you have. We don't want you to gather more information that the child is giving you, but certainly give all the information. You only need to have a reasonable suspicion that something has happened, and then it will be up to the child investigation team to, get that burden of proof. So we talked about all the things that we should do, but what are some of the things that we should not do when a child discloses? This slide outlines some of the suggestions that I would have to not do when a child is disclosing abuse to you. One of the most important things kind of falls into place with all the others is to remember to not try to investigate or suggest answers to the child. You want to listen to the child, reflect back what they're telling you, and validate what they're saying, but it's not up to the adult that the child's disclosing to investigate unless you're part of that child investigation team. It's important not to sterilize the disclosure. So if the child uses the word penis or vagina, it's important for you not to change that language that child is using. It may make someone uncomfortable if a child says, so-and-so touched my penis or so-and-so touched my vagina. And it is very common for an adult to kind of sterilize that and parrot it back and say, oh, they touched your private parts. And although that's not something that necessarily is going to make or break our case, it is important to remember not to sterilize what they're saying to you. It's important not to re-ask the child more questions after the allegation has been reported. So if it's been reported and the child has had a forensic interview, it's important to not re-question them. We don't want you to criticize or minimize their situation. And certainly it's really important to not coach them what to say. So sometimes parents might ask, what can I do? What am I supposed to tell them about going to the Child Advocacy Center for an interview? And it's really critical to remember you don't want to tell them what they're supposed to say, but to reinforce and prepare them and explain to them, you're going to go and you're going to talk to some people that have questions for you. And it's important to just tell them what happened and those kinds of things. So then if anyone ever asks a child what happened, or what did, mom or what did dad, tell you about going, to the Child Advocacy Center, they're going to say, well, they told me to tell you everything that happened, or they told me to tell you the truth. I talked a little bit about not making promises that we can't keep. We don't want to say things like everything will be okay, or I won't tell anyone if you tell me. We don't want to make those kinds of promises because we can't keep them. And, everything will be okay. Well, certainly we're going to do everything we can to keep that child safe, but saying things like everything will be okay, we don't know that. So what it feels like to be okay is very different from us than it might be for a child. It's also really important not to display that shock or that disapproval. Asking why questions, the who, what, when, where, again, that is not up to the person the child's disclosing to. Certainly in the process of that disclosure, a child may tell you those things, and it is important to kind of keep those things in your mind so you can tell the child hotline when you're calling them, but it is not up to you to ask those questions. So don't feel compelled to ask further and get as much information as you need, because we want to be able to do that in a very sterilized environment in a way to make sure that their information that they're given is done in a way that's very structured using a forensic interviewing protocol. And the other thing is we don't want to use threats or intimidation. We don't want to bribe the child even. We've had parents that the child might not want to come because, they don't want to talk about what happened. Go and talk to them and I'll buy you your new favorite toy or something like that. We don't want that to happen, because during that interviewing process, if a child was to come out and say, my daddy told me if I come here and tell you everything, or if my dad, told me to come here and tell you this, that they would buy me a toy. We don't want that to be somewhat perceived that they were bribed and then coached to say certain things. We want to keep kind of that, protection of their disclosure, there at all times. So I mentioned safety planning and how critical it is to make sure that we have a safety plan in place. And you might be thinking, what is a safety plan? Like, what do you mean by that? So now we're going to talk a little bit more about kind of what are the next steps. So a child makes a disclosure or there's an allegation that something happened. And what do we do as the caregivers or the adults in the child's life to make sure that they are safe and that we have a safety plan in place? So a report's been made to the hotline or local law enforcement is involved, and we now have what we call supportive caregivers. So this may or may not be you, it may be a parent. The supportive caregiver is the person in the child's life that is there to ensure the safety and well-being of that child, who are also supportive in this process. Remember, disclosure is a process. And certainly during a child abuse investigation, it's also important to have someone in that child's life that they view as being supportive to help them through this process. Supportive caregivers, part of that safety planning would be to not bring it up with the child. If a child brings it up, just listen to them, provide them with the supportive role that they may need. Asking, questions is very typical of a child, but we want to make sure that if they ask those questions, be honest, make sure that you're supportive to them. Tell them that you believe them. And if you don't know something of what's going to happen, or if they're asking you kind of about those next steps, it's okay to say, I don't know, but let me find someone who can figure that out. It's also really important as supportive caregivers to make sure that we're avoiding having conversations in front of the child with others. If law enforcement or child protective services comes to the home, typically they will ask to speak with the caregivers separate from the child, and this is a way to create safety for that child. We don't want that child to feel like those conversations are going to happen. It can lead to a lot of psychological issues with a child and re-traumatize the child. And just be really aware of your emotions. And if it's very difficult for you, or if there's a moment where you're finding that it's really greatly impacting you in a negative way, to take a break from that child, finding ways, but also be aware that that could happen, and kind of safety plan in your own mind. What am I going to do to help take care of myself in the moment so that I can be fully present to help that child when this is coming up or when this is happening? Further discussing safety plans, as we mentioned earlier, sometimes children who are sexually abused may exhibit problematic sexualized behaviors. Knowing this, it is incredibly important to make sure that you are developing safety plans and creating healthy boundaries and limit setting with children. If children are acting out on other children, or they are exhibiting certain behaviors that are sexualized in nature, it would be really important as a supportive caregiver to have an understanding of those behaviors and what's healthy and what's not, and kind of coming up with a safety plan of how you're going to further set those boundaries and making sure that you're also keeping other children safe if the child is exhibiting these problematic sexualized behaviors, especially sexually acting out on other children. Increasing supervision. There are times when children who are sexually abused that do not have that emotional regulation or that impulse control to stop themselves from sexually acting out or to stop themselves. We find that sometimes children may engage in self-masturbating behaviors, and kind of that limit setting is going to be really important, but also increasing that supervision to not only protect them from potentially acting out on others, but also protecting other children from being sexually acted out on by the child who is demonstrating the problematic sexualized behaviors. These safety plans also should include school planning, making sure that if you are observing, problematic sexualized behaviors in the home, making sure that the school is aware and ensuring that these safety plans are being developed and, kind of executed across all levels of the child's life. So in school, at home, at a caregiver's, if they go to a babysitter or a daycare center, making sure that all of those different areas are kind of aware of the behaviors and having a good plan in place to make sure that there is increased supervision and healthy boundary setting.
The most important thing for me with my children was to try to help them understand what it felt like to be uncomfortable with somebody. And that is going to be true no matter what type of assault. It could be a bully situation, it could be a stranger, it could be someone you know. And if we would just start to teach our kids, whenever you don't feel comfortable, let's just talk about it. Kids get that word. Even when they're 3 or 4 years old, they get that word.
When my niece 50 years ago was 2, I was dressing her, we were going somewhere, and I said, "Oh, you look so pretty, I just want to kiss you." And she said to me, "Good, Auntie, but kiss on the face, don't kiss on the mouth," meaning mouth. What hit me was at 2, bless my sister-in-law's heart, that's what she was teaching my niece. Boundaries, proper touching, proper kissing. And even though I was an aunt she adored, I was not to kiss her on the mouth.
My children will come to me all the time and say, he said this, is that okay? And, I said, well, thank you so much for coming and talking to Mommy about that. He was telling a joke, or no, that's not okay for him to say that. It's really important that we not only tell children to come to us when they're uncomfortable about something, but that they also come to us with their questions.
So we've talked a lot about the reactions that children may have or may not have when being sexually abused. And now we're going to talk a little bit about kind of that internal component and how children feel after being sexually abused. I've kind of broken it down into 5 different areas. And it's important to remember that not all children will feel these certain ways, and there may be some feelings that children may have that are not listed on here, but oftentimes these are pretty common reactions in terms of emotional capacity and feelings that children may have when being sexually abused. In terms of fear, children may fear their abuser. They may feel their family being taken away. They may feel being different. They may feel that what's happened to them is something that they should be ashamed of or be embarrassed. In terms of anger, children may be upset with their abuser. Oftentimes children, when they're abused over a long period of time, they will grow to be very resentful. And it's super confusing for them because remember, a lot of times children that are abused at a very young age, they don't realize that what's happening to them is not okay. So certainly if this abuse continues to happen, it can become more confusing. And certainly as they get in that that stage of, understanding that it's not okay, it can cause a lot of anger. It can also cause anger towards the adults that didn't protect them or siblings that didn't protect them. And even sometimes, a child may feel anger at themselves because now the abuse has occurred to them, and then it started happening to a sibling or another, a child in their life, and they may feel angry or kind of guilty that they didn't speak up and say anything, and now it's happened to somebody else. Grief and loss, offenders getting into trouble. Children sometimes will be very upset if their offender gets in trouble. The loss of relationships. Remember that these children are often abused by people that they know, love, and trust. And people that they know, love, and trust, oftentimes they don't want them to get into trouble. They may feel isolated. They may feel alone and not realize that this is something that does happen to others and that they feel like they can't talk about the abuse. They may feel that everything was taken away from them and that they disclosed, and, the reactions following that disclosure, led to a lot of loss in their life, and they may grieve that loss. They may also feel very betrayed by a loved one or even a caregiver. If the abuse happened by a parent and now the other parent didn't believe them, they may also feel very isolated and feel very alone. Also, guilt and shame, unable to stop the abuse. They may feel guilt or shame for telling or for even keeping it a secret. Oftentimes we find that they feel guilt or shame about their body's response. Remember, we talked about the fact that we are sexual beings. So at times when abuse occurs, it may feel good. It may not feel like abuse. So we use the word abuse, but that's not what it feels or is perceived as during the abuse when it's happening. They may feel guilt or shame when it happens, and that they still love their abuser. It's incredibly confusing. Like, how could something like this happen to me? But yeah, I still love them and I still care very much about them. So I previously mentioned that a lot of times we find that children who have experienced trauma will often have a diagnosis of ADHD. And sometimes those symptoms exist. We often find also that children of trauma will lack that kind of abstract reasoning or those problem-solving skills. They may space out a lot and not really be able to make plans. Sometimes those plans, can be very difficult for them to be able to kind of reason and kind of work out, like, what am I going to do next? We also find that a lot of times those children really react strongly to any sudden changes in schedule. So they're not really able to plan that out, but when their schedule is kind of rigid and has that, very structured flow, it can be very triggering for them, and they can react in a very negative way when there's a sudden change to that schedule. We often find that they can be easily distracted or have triggers to that trauma, which can then, have very negative reactions from them. They may have poor language development, and they also may have a really difficult time taking in new information. So when we're talking about kind of the cognitive development of children, they're already kind of in this phase of development and what that means. And when a child is faced with trauma or has a traumatic experience, those things are all very greatly impacted. We talked about mental health and how a lot of times, it's comorbid. So there's a lot of other disorders that can also present themselves. So children who are victims of trauma, we often see they have dissociation, they have depression, ADHD, sleep disturbances, certainly anxiety and PTSD, reactive attachment disorders. And, I put on here, the world is bad and can be so very defensive. And it's important to remember that when children are impacted by trauma, that these mental health factors that come into play or these symptoms of mental health can be very overwhelming, especially if the adult of the child's life does not have a good understanding of why these mental health symptoms are occurring when they're not addressed in a way from a trauma response. And we don't have a trauma therapist involved with the child. It can be very difficult to kind of weed these out and, focus on them one by one.
In the mid-90s, the CDC and Kaiser Permanente discovered an exposure that dramatically increased the risk for 7 out of 10 of the leading causes of death in the United States. In high doses, it affects brain development, the immune system, hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. Folks who are exposed in very high doses have triple the lifetime risk of heart disease and lung cancer and a 20-year difference in life expectancy. And yet doctors today are not trained in routine screening or treatment. Now, the exposure I'm talking about is not a pesticide or a packaging chemical. It's childhood trauma. Okay, what kind of trauma am I talking about here? I'm not talking about failing a test or losing a basketball game. I am talking about threats that are so severe or pervasive that they literally get under our skin and change our physiology. Things like abuse or neglect, or growing up with a parent who struggles with mental illness or substance dependence. Now, for a long time, I viewed these things in the way I was trained to view them, either as a social problem, refer to social services, or as a mental health problem, refer to mental health services. And then something happened to make me rethink my entire approach. When I finished my residency, I wanted to go someplace where I felt really needed, someplace where I could make a difference. So I came to work for California Pacific Medical Center, one of the best private hospitals in Northern California. And together, we opened a clinic in Bayview Hunters Point, one of the poorest, most underserved neighborhoods in San Francisco. Now, prior to that point, there had been only one pediatrician in all of Bayview to serve more than 10,000 children. So we hung a shingle and we were able to provide top quality care regardless of ability to pay. It was so cool. We targeted the typical health disparities: access to care, immunization rates, asthma hospitalization rates, and we hit all of our numbers. We felt very proud of ourselves. But then I started noticing a disturbing trend. A lot of kids were being referred to me for ADHD, or attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. But when I actually did a thorough history and physical, what I found was that for most of my patients, I couldn't make a diagnosis of ADHD. Most of the kids I was seeing had experienced such severe trauma that it felt like something else was going on. Somehow, I was missing something important. Now, before I did my residency, I did a master's degree in public health. And one of the things that they teach you in public health school is that if you're a doctor and you see 100 kids that all drink from the same well, and 98 of them develop diarrhea, you can go ahead and write that prescription for dose after dose after dose of antibiotics, or you can walk over and say, what the hell is in this well? So I began reading everything that I could get my hands on about how exposure to adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. And then one day, my colleague walked into my office and he said, Dr. Burke, have you seen this? In his hand was a copy of a research study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. That day changed my clinical practice and ultimately my career. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Study is something that everybody needs to know about. It was done by Dr. Vince Felitti at Kaiser and Dr. Bob Onda at the CDC, and together they asked 17,500 adults about their history of exposure to what they called adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. Those include physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, physical or emotional neglect, parental mental illness, substance dependence, incarceration, parental separation or divorce, or domestic violence. For every yes, you would get a point on your ACE score. And then what they did was they correlated these ACE scores against health outcomes. What they found was striking. Two things. Number one, ACEs are incredibly common. 67% of the population had at least one ACE, and 12.6%, 1 in 8, had 4 or more ACEs. The second thing that they found was that there was a dose-response relationship between ACEs and health outcomes. The higher your ACE score, the worse your health outcomes. For a person with an ACE score of 4 or more, their relative risk of chronic obstructive pulmonary disease was 2.5 times that of someone with an ACE score of 0. For hepatitis, it was also 2.5 times. For depression, it was 4.5 times. For suicidality, it was 12 times. A person with an ACE score of 7 or more had triple the lifetime risk of lung cancer and 3.5 times the risk of ischemic heart disease, the #1 killer in the United States of America. Well, of course, this makes sense. You know, some people looked at this data and they said, come on, you have a rough childhood, you're more likely to drink and smoke and do all these things that are going to ruin your health. This isn't science. This is just bad behavior. It turns out this is exactly where the science comes in. We now understand better than we ever have before how exposure to early adversity affects the developing brains and bodies of children. It affects areas like the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure and reward center of the brain that is implicated in substance dependence. It inhibits the prefrontal cortex, which is necessary for impulse control and executive function, a critical area for learning. And on MRI scans, we see measurable differences in the amygdala, the brain's fear response center. So there are real neurologic reasons why folks exposed to high doses of adversity are more likely to engage in high-risk behavior. And that's important to know. But it turns out that even if you don't engage in any high-risk behavior, you're still more likely to develop heart disease or cancer. The reason for this has to do with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the brain's and body's stress response system that governs our fight or flight response. How does it work? Well, imagine you're walking in the forest and you see a bear. Immediately, your hypothalamus sends a signal to your pituitary, which sends a signal to your adrenal gland that says, release stress hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And so your heart starts to pound, your pupils dilate, your airways open up, and you are ready to either fight that bear or run from the bear. And that is wonderful if you're in a forest and there's a bear. But the problem is what happens when the bear comes home every night. And this system is activated over and over and over again. And it goes from being adaptive or life-saving to maladaptive or health-damaging. Children are especially sensitive to this repeated stress activation because their brains and bodies are just developing. High doses of adversity not only affect brain structure and function, they affect the developing immune system, developing hormonal systems, and even the way our DNA is read and transcribed. So for me, this information threw my old training out the window, because when we understand the mechanism of a disease, when we know not only which pathways are disrupted, but how, then as doctors, It is our job to use this science for prevention and treatment. That's what we do. So in San Francisco, we created the Center for Youth Wellness to prevent, screen, and heal the impacts of ACEs and toxic stress. We started simply with routine screening of every one of our kids at their regular physical, because I know that if my patient has an ACE score of 4, she's 2.5 times as likely to develop hepatitis or COPD. She's 4.5 times as likely to become depressed, and she's 12 times as likely to attempt to take her own life as my patient with 0 ACEs. I know that when she's in my exam room. For our patients who do screen positive, we have a multidisciplinary treatment team that works to reduce the dose of adversity and treat symptoms using best practices, including home visits, care coordination, mental health care, nutrition, holistic interventions, and yes, medication when necessary. But we also educate parents about the impact of ACEs and toxic stress the same way you would for covering electrical outlets or lead poisoning. And we tailor the care of our asthmatics and our diabetics in a way that recognizes that they may need more aggressive treatment given the changes to their hormonal and immune systems. So the other thing that happens when you understand this science is that you want to shout it from the rooftops, because this isn't just an issue for kids in Bayview. I figured the minute that everybody else heard about this, it would be routine screening, multidisciplinary treatment teams, and it would be a race to the most effective clinical treatment protocols. Yeah, that did not happen. And that was a huge learning for me. What I had thought of as simply best clinical practice, I now understand to be a movement. In the words of Dr. Robert Block, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics, adverse childhood experiences are the single greatest unaddressed public health threat facing our nation today. And for a lot of people, that's a terrifying prospect. The scope and scale of the problem seems so large that it feels overwhelming to think about how we might approach it. But for me, that's actually where the hope lies. Because when we have the right framework, when we recognize this to be a public health crisis, then we can begin to use the right toolkit to come up with solutions. From tobacco to lead poisoning to HIV/AIDS, the United States actually has quite a strong track record with addressing public health problems. But replicating those successes with ACEs and toxic stress is going to take determination and commitment. And when I look at what our nation's response has been so far, I wonder, why haven't we taken this more seriously? You know, at first, I thought that we marginalized the issue because it doesn't apply to us, right? That's an issue for those kids in those neighborhoods, which is weird because the data doesn't bear that out. The original ACEs study was done in a population that was 70% Caucasian, 70% college educated. But then, the more I talk to folks, I'm beginning to think that maybe I had it completely backwards. If I were to ask how many people in this room grew up with a family member who suffered from mental illness, I bet a few hands would go up. And then if I were to ask how many folks had a parent who maybe drank too much, or who really believed that if you spare the rod, you spoil the child, I bet a few more hands would go up. Even in this room, this is an issue that touches many of us. And I'm beginning to believe that we marginalize the issue because it does apply to us. Maybe it's easier to see in other zip codes because we don't want to look at it. We'd rather be sick. Fortunately, scientific advances and, frankly, economic realities make that option less viable every day. The science is clear. Early adversity dramatically affects health across a lifetime. Today, we are beginning to understand how to interrupt the progression from early adversity to disease and early death. And 30 years from now, the child who has a high ACE score and whose behavioral symptoms go unrecognized, whose asthma management is not connected, and who goes on to develop high blood pressure and early heart disease or cancer will be just as anomalous as a 6-month mortality from HIV/AIDS. People will look at that situation and say, what the heck happened there? This is treatable. This is beatable. The single most important thing that we need today is the courage to look this problem in the face and say, this is real and this is all of us. I believe that we are the movement. Thank you.
So how do we help a traumatized child? This outlines a lot of different ways in which we can be supportive in the lives of children who've experienced trauma. And it's really important to understand that each child is so different, and we need to follow kind of their direction, and understanding what may work for them may not work for another child. This kind of outlines some of those suggestions. For instance, not shutting the child down if the abuse is brought up, offering comfort and answering questions the best that you can. Remember previously when we talked about disclosures, we talked about always being honest and giving information that you know to be truthful. Looking for triggers and adjusting the child's activity. It may be very overwhelming for a child to do an activity that may be perceived as fun to another child. It may not be fun for a child who's experienced trauma. There's a lot of different things that they're going to be bringing to situations. So understanding that and being able to have the flexibility to kind of adjust and change things based on their triggers. Providing predictable and daily patterns. Remember, we talked earlier about kind of that unpredictability and the unknown not being a positive thing for most children who've experienced trauma. So making children having clear patterns, clear rules, and kind of maintaining those structures as much as possible can really be helpful for a child in minimizing further symptoms. Also talking about giving appropriate choices and giving them a sense of control, allowing them to have some level of control in the decisions that they're making, but finding a balance between giving them choices and also modeling proper personal boundaries and giving, clear rules, but letting them have some sense of control over them. Following their direction and expecting emotional and behavioral problems. So understanding that, when you're going certain places or doing certain things, you don't really know when a trigger may occur, and understanding that those behavioral problems can be managed and be, easy on the fact that we don't want to judge those situations. Also want to define who are trusted adults, allowing the children to have control over the people that they're around and when, and not assuming that they may be okay with one thing or not another. Allowing them to make those choices about affection, and making sure that they're comfortable with certain situations and asking ahead of time. We talked about, safety planning and making sure that there are a lot of safety measures put into place to keep them safe and to keep other kids safe. And certainly that it's going to be much more helpful to a child who has experienced trauma, certainly. Now we're going to talk about child abuse investigations. And before we start going into how we do things now, I want to talk a little bit about how we used to conduct child abuse investigations. When an allegation of child abuse is made, a child abuse investigation will be initiated to include each of these disciplines listed. Each discipline is a critical component to ensure the safety and well-being of children. Without a child advocacy center, a child would be asked details of the alleged abuse over and over again, sometimes leading to secondary trauma. As an adult, imagine being asked to tell every detail about your last sexual experience to at least 6 different individuals. Would you feel comfortable? We're assuming as an adult that your last experience would have been a consensual and positive experience. If this was not the case, would it make these conversations more difficult, especially having to tell them 6 different times? Do you think your story would be exactly the same every single time you had to retell it? We discovered that this is what we were asking of children. Now, when a child abuse allegation is made, a child abuse investigation will be initiated. That same multidisciplinary team, or MDT, of individuals will continue to work together to gather information to ensure the safety and well-being of the child. Now, however, this MDT will work tirelessly to ensure the child is always at the center of their focus. They work together to minimize further trauma to the child and come together to meet the needs of the child rather than the child having to go to each one of them. The primary goal of all child advocacy centers is to ensure that children disclosing abuse are not further victimized by the intervention systems designed to protect them. CACs are child-focused facilities designed to create a sense of safety and security for child victims. At a CAC, representatives from all these different disciplines will come together to work in the best interest of the child who has been a victim of abuse. We bring everyone to the child. No one discipline can handle an investigation alone, and by working together, sharing each other's strengths, all the disciplines can be more effective in protecting children and prosecuting offenders. By conducting the interview jointly, more thorough information is obtained and duplicative interviewing is eliminated. Enhanced communication among the MDT allows for better and more informed decision-making, and a family history is more readily available to the team. Regular interactions provide support, reduces burnout, and provides a better understanding of and respect for each other's roles and responsibilities. Specialized training is there to meet the unique needs of abused children and their families to professionals investigating child abuse. More efficient use of agencies' resources, including staff time, will enhance communication and reduce burnout and secondary trauma to the staff working these cases. This will also improve investigations and the prosecution, often leading to less recantations and more confessions. Non-offending caregivers will be better informed and develop stronger supports with the use of advocacy services through this model. The Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes has 3 different locations. Our main location is in Canandaigua on North Main Street. We also have 2 satellite locations in Yates and Seneca County. In Yates County, we are located at 230 Lake Street in Penn Yan, and in Waterloo, we are located on 17 West Main Street in Waterloo. The services outlined on this slide are provided for the families and the multidisciplinary teams that we serve in Ontario, Seneca, and Yates County. Now I'm going to go into a little more depth on how the Child Advocacy Center model actually works. A question that I get asked often is what happens once a report is made? Once a report is made to the State Central Registry or the Child Abuse Hotline, a report will be generated either through Child Protective Services or what we call a law enforcement referral. The Child Advocacy Center receives most reported cases that go to Child Protective Services and law enforcement. Once that report is made, a caseworker or law enforcement officer will call the CAC to schedule what we call a scheduled forensic interview. A child advocacy specialist, also known as an advocate, will be assigned to the family. All CAC cases that come through the center will be reviewed monthly on an ongoing basis as needed to make sure that the best services and all needs to best support the child and their family are in place. When a child and their family come to the Child Advocacy Center, they will be greeted by a child advocate. This advocate will sit with the family during the forensic interview, and they will assist with any referrals that are necessary for services to provide for that child and their family. Advocates provide ongoing support as needed and certainly are there to support the family during the process of the forensic interview and beyond. If a case is referred to the district attorney's office for criminal prosecution, the family may also be referred to a victim witness assistance coordinator through the district attorney's office. The Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes contracts with Safe Harbors of the Finger Lakes for all victim advocacy services. The Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes has multiple child advocates on site that provide the following services: crisis intervention, victims' rights, support through medical exams and treatment, advocacy and support during law enforcement interactions, accompaniment to court, safety planning, victim impact statements, and case review meetings. Earlier, I mentioned the multidisciplinary team in regards to the investigative team. That same team also includes additional individuals that help with the services after the forensic interview to best support the child's healing and growth. These disciplines also include victim advocacy, school staff, and child advocacy center staff. I get asked often how referrals are obtained through the Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes. Any child who is referred to the Child Advocacy Center must be done so through law enforcement or child protective services. This would occur during an active child abuse investigation. When the CPS is notified by the state central registrar that a parent or another person legally responsible has abused or allowed abuse of a child under the age of 18, their role is grounded in the safety and well-being of that child. The investigation of the abuse of the non-offending caregiver to protect them will be assessed immediately. And if a caretaker is not the alleged abuser, CPS may not take action. Safety is assessed of all children within 24 hours. With law enforcement, their role is grounded in public safety. The investigation of any criminal activity will be done so with victims and perpetrators. If it's not criminal in nature, they may not take action, but their response is immediate. Once a referral is made, the multidisciplinary team will have a pre-investigative conversation regarding the child abuse investigation. Minimal facts interviewing will be conducted, and a forensic interview will be scheduled with the Child Advocacy Center of the Finger Lakes. It is during these pre-investigative conversations the team will determine what is in the best interest of the child, and they will also evaluate whether medical exams or immediate actions need to be taken or not. Victim advocacy services will begin immediately, and when the child comes to the Child Advocacy Center for a forensic interview, they will meet that victim advocate who will be there to advocate them through the entire process. Once the child is forensically interviewed, the case will then be reviewed with the team and appropriate actions will be taken following that meeting. So I've made a lot of references to forensic interviews, and now I'm going to take some time to talk about what is a forensic interview and how is that different than just a conversation with a child. When a child discloses that they have been abused, it is important to make sure that we do the interviewing in a way that is by a trained forensic interviewer, asking structured questions that are outlined by a nationally accredited protocol. These questions are developed in a way that are culturally sensitive and developmentally appropriate based on the child's age. A forensic interview is a formal investigative interview that's done in a child-friendly environment and asking questions in a fact-finding nature. The goal is to obtain reliable information and determine what, if anything at all, has happened elicit the details that can corroborate or refute the information given by the child, and obtain clear statements from them in their own words in a legally defensible way. Once a forensic interview is scheduled, it is important to ensure that a child is given the appropriate support and prepared for the forensic interview. The team will ask questions such as, does the child have a disability? Does the child have a certain schedule that we need to take in consideration when scheduling the forensic interview? Do they need any special accommodations? Some of these accommodations may include language. Do they speak English or need a translator? As a forensic interview, you also want to take into consideration any cultural considerations that may be affecting the child. Do they have any special interests or hobbies? These things are really helpful when it comes to rapport building with an interviewer. Who do they live with, and what medical conditions or medications do they take? Do they have mental health issues? And if so, are they seeking any sort of treatment? This is really important because we also want to make sure, keeping the child's interest at heart, making sure that a forensic interview isn't going to negatively impact any therapeutic process the child is currently in. We also want to know, who are the supportive caregivers? We talked earlier a lot about recantation and the importance of having supportive caregivers. So when scheduling these interviews, we want to make sure that the person that's bringing the child to the Child Advocacy Center is a supportive caregiver and has the child's best interest at heart.